Thanks, everyone. I don't have slides. Those who've taken classes with me know that I don't use PowerPoint. So I'm a philosopher. I'm a little bit unusual among the Wharton faculty in that way, too. One of my research areas is climate ethics. So I think and write about what our obligations are when it comes to helping to address the threat of climate change. One of the papers I've been working on recently is about the ethics of offsetting the risks that are imposed by our emitting activities. So, of course, there are a lot of important empirical questions about offsetting that you may have come across. Does it really work? Are the organizations that sell offsets reliable and trustworthy, and so on? But as a philosopher, I focus on questions that can't be addressed with empirical methods alone, like what forms of offsetting are kind of in principle morally acceptable and which, if any, aren't, and why. So recently, a couple of other philosophers, Christian Berkey and Garrett Cullity at the Australian National University, have a paper arguing that while one form of offsetting is morally acceptable, another isn't. Specifically, they think that what they call offsetting by sequestering is okay, while offsetting by what they call forestalling isn't. So an example of offsetting by sequestering would be planting enough trees to capture an amount of CO2 equivalent to what you've released through your emitting activities. So this sequesters pollution that's kind of equivalent to what you've caused. And that's contrasted with offsetting by forestalling. An example of that would be paying other people to use, say, cooking methods that release less CO2 than the methods that they would have used had you not paid them. So the net result of offsetting by forestalling might be the same as the net result of offsetting by sequestering. But nevertheless, Berkey and Cullity think that offsetting by forestalling doesn't make your emitting activity okay, while offsetting by sequestering does. So that's kind of an interesting claim. Why do they think this? Well, they argue by using a method that's common in philosophy. So they argue by analogy. And they rely on intuitions about the cases that figure in the analogy. So here's how the analogy goes. Offsetting emissions by sequestering, they say, is like going boating in a river, where your boating releases some amount of a toxin, and then paying to run an extracting device, right? So you've got an extracting device that removes an equivalent amount of the toxin from the river. Offsetting emissions by forestalling, on the other hand, they say, is like paying your neighbor who was planning to go boating without running an extractor to cancel his trip and then going boating yourself in place of your neighbor. Right? And they think that intuitively, while boating and extracting, running the extracting device seems clearly okay, paying your neighbor and then replacing his planned boat trip with yours seems wrong, doesn't seem like it's an acceptable way of offsetting. So I argue that there's less of a morally important distinction here than Berkey and Cullity claim, but I argue that they are onto something that could be problematic about thinking that offsetting by forestalling is always okay. So to see the core of the argument that I make, imagine that it costs $100 to extract toxins equivalent to one boat trip. Now imagine that your neighbor is willing to cancel his wrongful boat trip, wrongful because he wasn't planning on extracting, for only $50. So if we treat offsetting by forestalling as acceptable whenever the net effect on emissions of your emitting and offsetting is the same as the net effect on emissions of offsetting by sequestering would be, then your neighbor's wrongfully intending to go boating without extracting could make it cheaper for you to permissibly go boating and release toxins into the river. And that, I think, is something that we should reject, at least in cases where paying what would be the full costs of offsetting by sequestering, that is, extracting, can improve things for people who are at risk, say, downstream of the toxins in the river even more. So my view is it's okay to pay your neighbor $50 to cancel his boat trip and to go boating yourself, but only if you also do $50 worth of extracting, which would actually make the net effect of your boating, paying your neighbor, and extracting a kind of reduction overall in the amount of toxin in the river. So it would be better than if you just did none of those things for the people downstream. So there are a lot of important implications of this argument. We think about these things because there are real-world implications, right, for things like offsetting emissions by forestalling in various ways in the real world. But I don't have time to go into that here. Happy to chat elsewhere if you are interested.